My name is Bailey. I'm 34 years old, and 10 minutes ago, my husband officially took everything I owned. He walked away with the house, my savings, and my grandfather's 2-ton iron safe, laughing because he thought he'd finally broken me. What he doesn't know is that I didn't lose the divorce. I just handed him a ticking time bomb, and he's about to find out exactly what's inside. The echo was the worst part. Every time a mover's boot hit the polished hardwood, the sound bounced off the bare white walls of the foyer, mocking me. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, my fingers mindlessly twisting a stray strand of my shoulder-length blonde hair. 6 years of marriage were being packed into cardboard boxes and loaded onto a fleet of trucks. Well, his 6 years. My 6 years were mostly being left behind in the disposable pile. "Careful with that corner," Grant's voice boomed from the study. It was that sharp, predatory tone he used when he was closing a deal, the one that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. Grant stepped into the hallway, looking every bit the corporate liquidator he was. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his hair gelled into a state of permanent perfection. He didn't look like a man going through a divorce. He looked like a man who had just won a championship. "Almost done, Bailey," he said, checking his gold watch. He didn't look at me, just through me. "The movers will have the last of it out by 4. You have until 5 to vacate. I've already had the locks scheduled for 5:01. "I heard you the first 5 times, Grant," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I looked past him into the study. 4 men were sweating and straining against the centerpiece of the room, my grandfather's safe. It was a massive 1920s-era black iron and brass rivets, weighing nearly a ton. It sat there like a dark anchor in the middle of the room. "You really fought for that, didn't you?" I asked, gesturing toward the safe. "Even after your lawyer told you the transport costs alone would be 5 figures. Grant finally looked at me, a smug, thin-lipped smile spreading across his face. "I'm a liquidator, Bailey. I know how to spot an undervalued asset. Your grandfather didn't spend 40 years in industrial construction just to leave behind a collection of family memories in a reinforced vault. Everyone in the city knew the Blackwood Collection was real. Gold, diamonds, bearer bonds, whatever he was hiding in there, it's mine now. The court order was very specific. All household fixtures and secured storage." He stepped closer, the scent of his expensive peppery cologne invading my space. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy, tarnished brass key and a small slip of paper with 3 sets of numbers scribbled on it. My hand trembled slightly, but not for the reason he thought. "Here," I said, holding them out, "the key for the inner gate and the combination for the outer dial. It's yours, Grant. All of it." He snatched them from my hand, his eyes gleaming. "Smart move. Fights are expensive, and you're officially out of money." He turned back to the movers, shouting orders to hurry up. I watched him for a moment, the man I once thought I'd grow old with, now reduced to a scavenger hunting for a treasure that didn't exist. I picked up my single cardboard box, the one containing my restoration tools and a few photos, and walked toward the front door. I didn't look back at the mansion. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was waiting for him inside that iron box, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could actually breathe. My new estate was a 500-square-foot studio above a noisy auto body shop. The air here didn't smell like expensive jasmine candles. It smelled of sawdust, turpentine, and the metallic tang of old engines. I loved it. I spent the first week scrubbing the grease off the floor until my knuckles bled, my shoulder-length blonde hair tied back with a piece of twine. I didn't have much, just my tools, a mattress on the floor, and a hot plate. But for the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy with Grant's disapproval. I was hunched over a 19th-century mahogany jewelry box, carefully scraping away layers of cracked varnish when the door creaked open. I bring gifts, Maya announced, stepping over a pile of sandpaper. She was holding 2 steaming cardboard cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled heavenly of glazed donuts. And by gifts, I mean caffeine and sugar, because I know you've been living on grit and spite. I sat back, wiping my hands on a rag. Spite is surprisingly low in calories, Maya, but I'll take the donut. Maya sat on the only other chair, a wobbly stool I'd found on the curb. She was a paralegal by day and my unofficial sanity checker by night. She looked around the cramped space, her eyes lingering on the tiny window that looked out onto a brick wall. "How are you really doing, Bea?" she asked, her voice softening. I saw the final filings. Grant's lawyer was gloating at the courthouse. He's telling everyone who will listen that Grant cleaned you out. I took a sip of the bitter coffee, letting the heat ground me. He did. He took the savings, the investment accounts, the house, and the safe. Especially the safe. Maya frowned, leaning in. "That's the part I don't get. Bailey, that safe was the only thing you actually asked for in the beginning. It was your grandfather's. Why did you just hand over the key?" I looked at the mahogany box on my workbench. Underneath the grime and the old, ugly finish, there was beautiful, solid wood waiting to be seen again. Because Grant only sees the finish, Maya. He sees the gold leaf and the shiny hardware. He doesn't understand the structure underneath. I paused, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. He's been obsessed with the Blackwood Collection since the day he met my grandfather. He thinks Grandpa hid a fortune in gold coins to avoid taxes. And didn't he? Maya asked. Grandpa was a construction foreman for some of the biggest industrial projects in the 70s. He saw things, Maya. He kept records. He told me once that the most dangerous thing you can own isn't a gun. It's the truth about what's buried under your feet. Before Maya could respond, my phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a notification from Instagram. I didn't even have to open it to know what it was. Grant had tagged me in a post. It was a photo of him and Chloe, the 24-year-old associate he'd been seeing behind my back, clinking champagne glasses in front of the safe. The caption read, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Finally cracking into the family vault tonight. Cheers to new beginnings and bigger assets." "He's so predictable," Maya hissed, looking over my shoulder. "He's going to spend a fortune hiring a locksmith to bypass the secondary tumblers." "Let him," I said, turning back to my mahogany box. "The more he fights for what's inside, the more he proves it belongs to him. That's the beauty of it. He wanted to be the sole owner of my grandfather's legacy. Now he's going to get exactly what he asked for." I picked up my scraper. I had work to do. Grant thought he had taken my future, but he was currently busy unearthing a past that was about to swallow him whole. The second week in the studio felt different. The initial adrenaline of the move-out had faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic scrape of my chisel. I was working on a mid-century vanity, sanded down to the pale, raw grain. It looked vulnerable, like I felt, but it was solid. My phone buzzed on the workbench, skittering across the wood shavings. I didn't even have to look to know it was Maya. She'd been stalking Grant's social media like it was her second job. "He did it," she said the moment I picked up. Her voice was a mix of awe and disgust. "He hired a specialist, some guy from out of state with a thermal lance and a digital bypass kit. It cost him a fortune, Bailey." I set the chisel down, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "And did he find the gold?" "No," Maya chuckled, though it sounded a bit nervous. "But he's posting photos of what he did find. He's calling it the Blackwood portfolio. He's literally in his study right now, surrounded by stacks of old leather-bound ledgers and maps. He looks like he just discovered a lost city." I walked over to the small sink and washed the sawdust off my hands. The water was cold, shocking my skin. "Water of what, Maya?" "Industrial plots. old factory zones. Some are in the Midwest, some are right here in the Valley. Grant's already bragging on LinkedIn about identifying untapped real estate assets hidden by your grandfather for decades. He thinks he's found a secret land empire that skipped the probate process. I looked at my reflection in the spotted mirror above the sink. My blonde hair was messy, tucked behind my ears, and there was a smudge of grease on my cheek. I looked like a woman who had lost everything. But I knew something Grant didn't. I remembered my grandfather, Elias Blackwood, sitting in his armchair with a glass of neat bourbon. He'd point at that safe with a trembling finger and say, "Bailey, some things are buried for a reason. You don't dig up a grave unless you want to catch what killed the man inside." "He's going to move on them, isn't he?" I asked. "He already is," Maya confirmed. "My firm got a heads up. Grant's filing quiet title actions on 4 of the largest properties today. He's trying to fold them into his personal holding company before the month is out. He wants to prove they were part of the marital estate he was awarded." A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty studio swept over me. This was the act of greed I knew Grant couldn't resist. "Bailey, you're being very quiet. Are you okay? Do we need to call the lawyer? If those properties are worth millions, maybe we can contest the—" "No," I interrupted, my voice sharp. "Don't contest a thing, Maya. Let him file. Let him put his name on every single deed. Let him swear under oath that he is the sole rightful owner of everything in that safe." "Why?" "Because those aren't assets, Maya. They're Superfund sites. My grandfather didn't own the land because it was valuable. He ended up with the titles because the construction companies he worked for went bankrupt trying to hide the fact that they dumped thousands of gallons of carcinogenic sludge into the water table in 1974. There was a long, dead silence on the other end of the line. "He didn't leave me a fortune," I whispered, looking out at the gray brick wall outside my window. "He left me a shield, and Grant just took it and turned it into a target." The smell of beeswax and orange oil always had a way of settling my nerves. It was thick and sweet, a sharp contrast to the biting cold of the winter morning pressing against the studio's thin windows. I was buffing the mahogany jewelry box, my arm aching from the repetitive motion, but I didn't stop. I liked the burn. It reminded me I was still capable of making something beautiful out of something forgotten. My peace was shattered by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of someone running up the wooden stairs. The door burst open, and Maya practically skated across the floor, her face flushed red from the cold. "It's happening," she gasped, holding her phone out like a holy relic. "He's doing a press release, a literal press release, Bailey, on the front steps of the mansion." I stopped buffing and looked at the screen. There was Grant, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than my SUV. Beside him stood Chloe, draped in cream-colored faux fur, her hand tucked possessively into his arm. Behind them, the massive iron safe sat on a heavy-duty pallet, its door swung wide like a gaping mouth. "I am proud to announce," Grant's voice tinny through the phone speakers, "that the Blackwood estate will be the cornerstone of a new era for Grant Sterling acquisitions. We've uncovered historical land holdings that have sat dormant for decades. These properties represent the backbone of this city's industrial history, and we intend to revitalize them." "He's so full of it," Maya muttered. "He doesn't want to revitalize anything. He wants to flip them to the highest bidder." "Watch his face," I said, leaning closer. As the reporters lobbed questions about the value of the Blackwood Collection, a man in a nondescript windbreaker stepped into the frame. He wasn't a reporter. He carried a clipboard and a thick manila envelope. He leaned in and whispered something to Grant, handing him a document. Grant's practiced winning smile didn't disappear, he was too professional for that, but it stiffened. It became a mask. He glanced down at the paper, then quickly tucked it into his coat pocket, laughing off a question about the safe's contents. "Who was that?" Maya asked. That, I said, my heart skipping a beat, was likely the first of many messengers. My grandfather didn't just keep the deeds in that safe, Maya. He kept the letters of non-compliance from the late 70s. He kept the soil samples that the previous owners tried to bury. Wait, Maya's eyes widened. If Grant officially claimed those deeds today, if he signed the affidavit of ownership to get them out of probate, then he just legally swore that he is the successor in interest. In the eyes of the Environmental Protection Agency, he didn't just buy land, he bought the debt, he bought the poison, and because he insisted on bypassing the corporate shell company I had set up for the sentimental items, he's personally liable. I turned back to my jewelry box, picking up the soft cloth. The EPA doesn't care about winning a divorce, Maya. They care about who has the deepest pockets to pay for a 40-year-old toxic spill. And Grant just spent 30 minutes on live television telling the world exactly who that person is. The video on the phone looped back to the beginning. Grant looked so powerful, so certain of his victory. I wondered how long it would take him to realize that the gold he thought he'd stolen was actually a mountain of lead. The silence in my studio was usually a comfort, but today it felt electric, like the air right before a massive thunderstorm. I was working on an old, scarred oak chair, my fingers tracing the deep gouges in the wood. Someone had tried to hide these marks with thick, dark paint years ago, but I was bringing the truth back to the surface. My blonde hair kept falling into my eyes, so I shoved it back with a forearm covered in fine sawdust. I didn't mind the mess. In this room, everything was honest. Then came the sound. Not the rhythmic running of Maya's footsteps, but a heavy, erratic pounding on the metal door downstairs. It sounded desperate. I didn't move. I waited. A few minutes later, my phone chimed. It was a FaceTime call from Maya. When I answered, her face was framed by the fluorescent lights of her law office, and she looked like she'd just seen a ghost. "Bailey, have you checked the business wires?" she whispered. "Grant's firm, Sterling Acquisitions, they just put out a voluntary freeze on all new investments, but that's not the half of it." "Tell me," I said, leaning back against my workbench. "The man in the windbreaker from the press conference, he wasn't just EPA, he was from the Department of Justice," Maya said, her voice trembling with excitement. "Because Grant moved those deeds into his personal holding company, bypassing the protections of the Blackwood estate shell, he's being hit with strict, joint, and several liability. Do you know what that means?" "It means it doesn't matter who put the sludge in the ground 40 years ago. It only matters who owns the ground today. And since the previous companies are long gone, the government is looking for one person to pay the entire bill. $10 million, B. That's the preliminary estimate for the groundwater remediation at the Valley site alone. And he owns 4 of them. His bank accounts haven't just been frozen, they've been flagged for seizure. Even the mansion is tied up in the litigation because he used it as collateral for the loans to develop those toxic lots." I looked down at the oak chair. I had reached the raw wood. It was pale and beautiful, finally free of the dark weight that had been choking it. "He wanted the weight," I said. "He fought for every pound of that safe. He told the judge that my family's history was his rightful compensation for the years he spent with me." "He's panicking, Bailey," Maya said, looking over her shoulder at her office door. "My boss said Grant's lawyer has been calling every 10 minutes, trying to find a way to rescind the transfer of assets. They're looking for you. They want to argue that you defrauded him by not disclosing the environmental hazards." I did disclose it. I listed that safe and its contents as hazardous personal effects in the initial filing. Grant's own lawyer laughed and had it struck from the record. He called it a petty attempt to devalue the marital estate. It's all in the court transcripts. The pounding on the door downstairs started again, louder this time. A car horn blared, a sharp, expensive-sounding European horn I recognized all too well. "I think he's here, Maya," I said, my voice remarkably calm. "Don't open that door alone," she warned. "I'm not alone," I said, looking around at the sturdy, honest pieces of furniture surrounding me. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." I hung up the phone and walked to the window. Down in the narrow alleyway, Grant's silver Porsche was parked crookedly across the entrance to the auto shop. He was standing by the door, his expensive suit rumpled, looking up at my window with a face full of terror. The hunter had finally realized he was in the trap. The heavy metal door at the bottom of the stairs groaned, followed by the slow, uneven thud of footsteps climbing toward me. These weren't the confident strides of the man who had evicted me. They were the steps of someone carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The door to my studio creaked open. Grant stood in the threshold, and for a second, I didn't recognize him. His charcoal overcoat was stained with salt from the street, his tie was loosened, and his hair, usually a perfect architectural feat, was matted and windblown. But it was his eyes that told the story. They were bloodshot and darting, the eyes of a cornered animal. "Bailey," he rasped. His voice was thin, stripped of its usual corporate resonance. I didn't stand up. I stayed on my stool, the oak chair I was restoring sitting between us like a shield. I picked up a piece of fine grit sandpaper and began to work on a stubborn knot in the wood. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "It's a mess down there, Grant," I said, not looking up. "You're blocking the delivery bay for the auto shop." He didn't answer. He walked into the room, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the floorboards covered in blonde sawdust. He looked around at the cramped, drafty space with a mixture of horror and desperation. "I've been thinking," he started, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets, "about the divorce, about how heated things got. It wasn't right, Bailey. Taking your grandfather's safe, that was petty of me. It was your family history. I shouldn't have let my lawyer push for it." I stopped sanding. I looked at him, really looked at him, letting the silence stretch until he began to sweat. "Is that so? Because last week you were on the evening news calling it the cornerstone of your new era." Grant winced as if I'd slapped him. He took a step closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was wrong. Look, I want to make it right. I'm prepared to sign the mansion back over to you. The house, the safe, the land titles, all of it. A full reversal of the asset split. I'll even throw in a $50,000 restarting fee for your business. We can tell the court it was a clerical error in the settlement." He pulled a thick packet of papers from his coat. I could see the header of his law firm at the top. He was practically vibrating with the urge to hand them to me. "You want me to take back the safe," I said flatly. "It belongs to you," he cried, his mask finally slipping. "It's your legacy, Bailey. Your grandfather wanted you to have those deeds." "No, Grant," I said, standing up slowly. I brushed the sawdust off my apron, the pale blonde strands of my hair catching the dim light of the studio. My grandfather knew someone worthy to have them. He knew that anyone with a shred of conscience would see those ledgers and spend their life trying to fix the damage. But he also knew that anyone with a heart full of greed would see them as a prize and get crushed by them. Grant's face went pale. You knew about the EPA. You set me up." "I didn't set you up.
I listed it correctly in the disclosure. You spent thousands of dollars in legal fees to prove that I was lying about the safe's value. You went on television and swore to the world that you were the sole owner of those properties. I walked over to him, pointing at the signature line on the papers he was holding. You didn't just take my everything, Grant. You took my grandfather's sins, and now they're legally yours.
Grant looked down at the papers in his hand, as if they had suddenly turned into a nest of vipers. His fingers twitched, and for a moment, I thought he might actually try to shove them into my wood-burning stove just to watch them disappear. "You don't understand," he whispered, his eyes unfocused. "They've started the seizure process. The mansion is gone, Bailey. The cars, the commercial holdings, it's all cross-collateralized. If I don't get these deeds out of my name, I'm not just broke, I'm bankrupt. I'll be in debt for 3 lifetimes." "I do understand," I said, picking up a soft cloth to buff the oak chair. "I understood it when I was sitting in that empty house, watching you take the light fixtures out of the ceiling. You wanted everything. You wanted to leave me with nothing so you could feel like you'd won the marriage." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. "Winning. God, what a joke. Chloe, she's gone, you know? She took the Porsche and whatever jewelry wasn't locked in the safe the second the first freeze notice hit the front door. She didn't even pack a bag, just vanished." I felt a grief flicker of something. Not pity, but a cold sort of recognition. Grant had surrounded himself with people who mirrored his own soul. When the assets disappeared, so did the loyalty. "You should leave, Grant," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I have a commission to finish, and the light is fading." "I'll sue you," he snapped, a sudden flare of his old, ugly arrogance returning. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face twisting. "I'll make sure you never work in this town again." I didn't even stop my work. "Go ahead. My lawyer has the transcripts from the discovery phase. You called the safe sentimental junk and a distraction tactic. You fought to have the environmental disclosures removed from the record because they devalued your prize. You did my work for me, Grant." He stood there for a long time, the silence of the studio pressing in on him. The only sound was the distant hum of a power tool from the shop downstairs and the wind rattling the window panes. He looked smaller than I ever remembered him being, a hollowed-out man in a very expensive coat. Without another word, he turned and walked out. I heard his heavy, slow steps on the wooden stairs, the sound of the metal door clanging shut, and then the roar of his engine as he sped away, fleeing a ghost he had invited into his own house. I walked over to my workbench and opened the small drawer at the back. Inside wasn't gold or deeds. It was a bundle of letters, tied with a simple piece of twine. These were the only things I had taken from the safe before the movers arrived. They were letters from my grandmother to my grandfather during their long months away at construction sites. They were filled with hope, with plans for a small garden, and with the kind of love that doesn't need a vault to stay safe. That was the real Blackwood Collection, and it was the only thing Grant never even thought to look for. The salt air was a different kind of medicine. It didn't just clear my lungs. It seemed to scrub the very memory of jasmine candles and cold marble floors from my skin. A year had passed since the day the Blackwood fortune had become a headline for all the wrong reasons. I stood in the doorway of my new workshop, a converted boathouse on a quiet stretch of the coast. My shoulder-length blonde hair was lighter now, bleached by the sun and a spray of the Atlantic. I wore a simple linen shirt and jeans stained with wood glue. I had never felt more like myself. The workshop was filled with the morning light. On my bench sat a small, delicate escritoire I had rescued from an estate sale, a piece no one else wanted because it was buried under decades of dust. I was restoring it for a local museum. No sharks, no liquidators, just the slow, honest work of making something whole again. Maya's voice startled me from the porch. "I told you that you'd forget to check the mail again." I turned to see her holding a stack of envelopes and 2 iced coffees. She looked different too, relaxed, her lawyer-sharp edges softened by the weekend visits to the coast. She handed me a coffee and a single crumpled newspaper clipping. "I thought you might want the final update on the Sterling acquisition saga," she said. I took the paper. The headline was small, buried in the legal section. "Final liquidation of Sterling Holding Corp. completed." The article detailed how Grant's firm had been dissolved to cover the first wave of environmental remediation fines. The mansion had been sold at auction to a nonprofit. "And Grant?" I asked, surprised at how little it hurt to say his name. "He's living in a studio apartment downtown, working as a junior clerk for a small-time collections agency. The irony is almost too much, isn't it? The man who spent his life liquidating others is now the one filing the paperwork for it. He'll be paying those EPA fines out of his wages for the rest of his life." I looked out at the ocean. The waves were steady, an eternal rhythm that made Grant's greed and my own past heartbreak seem like tiny, insignificant grains of sand. "I don't hate him anymore, Maya," I said, and realized I meant it. Hate is a weight, just like that safe. I'm just glad I'm not the one carrying it. I walked back to the workbench and picked up my bundle of grandmother's letters. I had framed one of them, the one where she talked about the first time she saw the ocean. It sat on my desk, a reminder that the most precious things in life don't need a combination to open and can't be taken in a divorce. "Ready to go for a walk?" Maya asked. "Just a minute," I replied. I picked up my polishing cloth and gave the old escritoire one last rub. The wood glowed, warm and resilient. I put my tools away, draped a cover over the bench, and stepped out onto the porch. I didn't look back at the workshop. I didn't need to. My past was settled, my hands were clean, and for the first time in my life, the only thing I was taking with me into the future was the light.